The Psalms is one of the greatest books throughout all of church history and throughout Jewish history. There's so much for us to learn and gain from these texts. And we have a special guest with us, Dr. Jonathan Klein, who's done a very intense research on this book. He's very well published, has a number of works that he's written and edited, presenting texts in their original languages. So we're very excited to get to have him with us today. Dr. Jonathan Klein, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you guys so much.
Yes,
delighted
welcome,
to be here.
welcome.
Thank you.
So let's just dive right in. One of the questions we just wanted to ask you was, when you're thinking of all the books to do a reader for, you've obviously, this is not your first reader that you've done, but when you're choosing this most recent project of yours to do the Psalms, where did this come from, this idea to do Psalms, and why do you think this book is so important to do one for?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, because there's so many biblical texts that one could make readers of course, and I'm always thinking of ideas along those lines. But yeah, the Psalms, I had done a book called The Proverb a Day previously, and Proverbs I thought lend themselves well to kind of slow meditative reading and working on like one verse a day. So that was how I set that up. But then thinking through the other texts in the Bible, Psalms just sticks out as something that I think most people would really love to read in the original. If you've studied Hebrew and you think of all the texts that you could spend time with and just kind of slow down and meditate on, Psalms of course comes to the fore. And thinking about just why Psalms has been so compelling to so many people over the centuries. They're very concrete and give voice to emotions and thoughts, but they're also so universal. And although they're culturally specific, they also can apply to so many circumstances. So they have a universal quality that's very compelling. And the Psalms they're raw, they're honest, they're unsanitized, and they give you permission to give voice to all sorts of emotions, and thoughts to God. And I think of it as a parent of young kids. A part of the practice of being a parent is that you want to kind of be there and provide a safe, calm space for your kids to experience the roller coaster of emotions that they experience. And that is a practice. It takes work. But I think of the Psalms being a little similar, where it's like kind of God provides that space for us to speak to all of the experiences of life and the ups and downs, and it not only gives permission for us to do that, but it encourages that. We can express joy, thanksgiving, gratitude, anger, sadness, all of those things. So again, there's the universality to the Psalms that make them so compelling. And I think that in terms of the advantage of reading the Psalms in Hebrew is that it allows you to really slow down, because you have to parse words and gloss. And so really forces you to think about, what's there, and to kind of read meditatively, just by virtue of the fact that you're reading it in a different language.
Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. I especially like that last point of slowing down when you're reading the Hebrew, having to parse things out. It really does. I mean, when you're reading narratives in the Hebrew Bible in that way, it's just amazing what you come across and what you don't see in maybe an English translation, or if you just weren't slowing down to consider the text in that way. So it's a great point. And that's very true regarding parenting. I can attest to that with two young boys. Absolutely. That is so true. So tell us, what really got you interested in doing this project from the beginning? And two, what is the purpose of the book, and what audience do you have in mind for this reader?
Yeah, the project had its genesis about 5 years ago. It was 2017. I came out with this series of, keep up your biblical Hebrew in 2 minutes a day, keep up your biblical Greek in 2 minutes a day, because in my own experience and, with folks I'd interacted with over the years, I know that for so many of us, it's just hard for a lot of reasons to keep up on our languages after we've studied them, whether it's a modern language like French or Spanish or whatever that we may have studied in high school or in college, or, Hebrew or Greek in college or seminary or whatever. It's just, there's so many factors that make it difficult to keep up with the languages, time and energy and work and everything. So I had just come out with that set of books, and I was thinking about what are other ways to make biblical text accessible to people. And so, the next kind of project was that Proverb a Day project that I mentioned. That kind of got off the ground around then too. And then, at the SBL annual meeting in 2017, Pete Myers, my co-author, and I, we just met up, and we were just, I think we both had the same vision to make the text really accessible, and so we just started spitballing ideas. And Pete suggested, what about the Psalms? And as we were talking about earlier, it's just it's such a great corpus. It's so compelling. And so I love the idea, and just one thing led to another, and we kept kind of brainstorming, like, what could this look like? What could the formatting look like? How can we structure the volume in a really pedagogically helpful way? To the point, to your question about audience and purpose of the book, we really did want to be pedagogical, and all of the language tools that I develop in this one in particular, I try to make them so that they can be accessible for somebody who's studied the language, in this case Hebrew, for even a semester or a year. But I want them also to be useful for people like us who have PhDs in biblical studies, because we're always learning, and of course, and there's always more to know and more to glean from the text. And so it's a really interesting challenge that I embrace about, like, how do you structure something? I mean, I very much view creating books like this, from a teacher's standpoint. And I think, like, okay, if you're teaching a class, obviously you have people at different ability levels with different learning styles. And so if you think of the audience of a book like that too, then, like, how do you structure something so that you're bringing technical material to a large audience so that it's kind of accessible to everybody, but there's enough kind of advanced technical stuff there that, like, if you want to dive deep into it, you can, but you don't have to do that immediately. You're not just overwhelmed with this glut of information. So it was a really nice synergistic process with Pete. He's just a brilliant guy, and we think similarly in various ways, but we also think differently. And so it's just a great back and forth about, like, well, what if we do this and what if we do that? And so I think we really tried to include a lot of features in the book in terms of the content and the formatting, so that you can open up the book and it kind of looks simple in a way. It's a text, there's some glosses, the parsing and stuff, but then there's stuff with the Masoretic cantillation as well that's, like, pretty complicated at its root, but we're just kind of saying, like, well, if you want to dive into this, there's an appendix, and we kind of structured the volume on the basis of the Masoretic cantillation. But if you don't really want to get into that, at least at first, you don't have to. So I guess, in short, the audience is kind of, everybody, because again, we trying to make this accessible. It's like we all want to read the Psalms, and we all want to read the biblical text in general, and so how do we make it as accessible to as many people as possible? And that's the real goal here.
I've really appreciated the types of work you've done. I think in a number of biblical Hebrew contexts, it's very common to go straight from your beginner textbook right to BHS, which nothing against BHS, but you're almost getting launched directly into textual criticism more than you are in actually being able to read and understand some of the text you're reading. So I think some of these readers that you've done, including the Psalms one, in my opinion, it's a better bridge to launch off from after you go through your first or second semester of Hebrew. You're really getting deep with the language, and you clearly have an eye, because the editing really matters here. How do you present the text? What information do you give? How do you give it? And this is probably your most unique work, I would say, so far, because of the vast amount you're giving. But I would attest, again, after having gone through it, this is perfect for both the first semester and the advanced person because of how you laid it out. You can go and find what you want. Anyway, we'll get more into your reader later, but just, again, I've very much enjoyed this work that you've done throughout your career, as well as this individual one. So
thanks.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say thanks so much. And also just say, I appreciate it. And I have a lot of thoughts along these lines, but it does really take a village, and Pete was, brilliant. And, people in my office too, they are always providing feedback too. So it's definitely a collective work. But thank you.
Sure. In fact, for some listeners, people watching this, they might think, hey, this is a little bit of a deja vu episode. We did an episode on this book, but I love the idea of team. This is why I love getting to do this podcast with Nathan. And that's why I think it's so cool to interview both you and Pete, because you both bring different skill sets, as well as the whole team behind the publishing of this book. and life takes a village. So I think it's really cool that you guys came together along with your team to make this happen. So another question I wanted to ask you about is you make a really interesting point in your introduction about how reading the Psalms in Hebrew can feel like visiting a foreign country. I found that a really interesting picture. Can you explain what does that mean?
Yeah, as we were reflecting on the material, it seemed like an apt analogy because, yeah, of course, it's just interesting, especially with texts that are well known, like you think of Psalms or the Gospels, say, when you read them in the original Hebrew or Greek, there's this large amount of familiarity, of course. Often you don't need to consult a lexicon as often as you might for a passage you didn't know as much, for example. But simultaneously, there's this element of discombobulation where, it sounds really different. And there's just, you kind of have to slow down. And sometimes you get tripped up and you're like, does this mean what I thought it meant? And all that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, it really reminded us of, just visiting another country where, there's can be so many differences, but, to boil it down, like at least there's the language difference and the cultural difference in a lot of cases. And so those provide, on the one hand, a kind of barrier to, interaction, but they also allow you to explore and they open up a richness. That's one of the things about getting to know a new culture is that it's difficult, but it's so rich. And it's partly because it's difficult that you kind of have to work through, you have to work to get to know people and to speak and even have little interactions like buying food and things like that. And so I think that, of course, approaching any ancient texts but any modern text in a foreign language is like that, but especially ancient texts, Bible included, of course, we're at a linguistic remove, we're at a cultural remove, and we're also at a large temporal remove. And so that's an added layer that, if you're visiting another country, at least you don't have the time gap, but with an ancient text, you have that too, which of course, all these things are related. And so, I think that's, definitely we were just trying to speak to our own experience of reading the Psalms. And we reflect on Psalm 23 there where, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And, that's, kind of in iambic pentameter and kind of Shakespearean style poetry. It just kind of sounds like what we traditionally think poetry should sound like in English. But in Hebrew, it's that first verse is Adonai roi lo echsar. It just sounds, it's a lot more terse. There are guttural sounds that we don't have in English. And it's kind of discombobulating. It doesn't sound exactly like poetry, typically sounds or traditional poetry sounds in English. And so, it seems like you're in this unfamiliar territory, but again, that's where it can be kind of make it difficult at first to figure out to connect with the text in a way, but then it causes you again to slow down and to really, kind of meditate and see how this poetry works. This is not our native poetry, but it's an equally beautiful poetry. And it's kind of like, tasting a new meal, that you've never tasted. It's just, it could seem odd at first, but then you kind of acquire the taste and it can be better than anything you ever, tasted before.
Yeah, that's excellent. I really like that emphasis, especially on how we are to engage, an ancient text on the cultural level. But yes, the temporal piece is important, isn't it? I mean, we are so removed in time as well. It's very important to have that aspect when we're coming to an ancient text. So nice to hear you sort of use some Hebrew there and give us some of the hearing of it, right? So you've done a lot of research on Soundplay in the Hebrew Bible, haven't you? So we have two questions on that note then. So how do the authors of the Hebrew Bible use Soundplay in their communication? And are there any examples that you'd like to highlight in the Psalms that you have in this reader?
Yeah, Soundplay is it's an interesting phenomenon. And it's an interesting term too, because it's a misnomer in a way. It's too bad that we don't have a different term that we standardly use, because it kind of reflects how across different cultures sound patterning has functioned in different ways. And there's a book called The Pun Also Rises about the history of punning and sound play throughout cultures, and over time. And the author talks about how in some cultures, punning was a very high art form, and in others, and this tends to be the case in our, at least present day American culture, that punning is kind of a low art form in a way, or it's common to like kids' jokes and things like that. But, you don't think of punning as kind of like this highfalutin literary technique necessarily. But that's not always been the case. Punning and sound patterning has worked differently over the ages and across cultures. And so in the Hebrew Bible, there's sound play all over the place, just use of similar consonants, repeated consonants, similar vowel sounds, all that kind of thing. And naturally that exists in English too. I mean, good literature sounds good. Yeah. And so, of course, I guess what I'm kind of teasing out here is you need to differentiate. There can be different kinds of, sound play and punning and things like that. But I'm just reflecting on the term sound play. So anyway, to get to your question though, about, how does sound play, or paranomasia is the technical term, how does that function in the Hebrew Bible? It functions for it has a lot of purposes. And so, it can be used for just kind of purely aesthetic effect, just for euphony and, making something sound like delightful literature. But as you well know, it can be used for a lot of kind of more, I guess, literary purposes, in the sense of like developing narratives or providing etiologies. So, like when Isaac is named, it says his name Yitzchak is from the root sachak, to laugh. And so, right. Sarah laughs, sachak. And so it's an etiology for his name. Or like the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11, it says they named it Bavel because their god, Balal, he confused their languages, so there's sound play there. So a lot of time in the Bible, when you get somebody or a person or a place being named, there can be sound play on that, to kind of almost as if like there's something inherent in the word itself that like reflects the person's destiny or something, which is really interesting. Then you get that elsewhere in the ancient Near East. I'll just give a couple more examples maybe before moving on to the Psalm. Is that some really well-known ones, like in Amos 8. He says, God shows Amos this basket of summer fruit, and the word for summer fruit is kites. and so he says, like, what do you see, Amos? And he says, I see, summer fruit kites. And then God says, well, yeah, and ba ha-kates, the end is coming. So it's like the word end, and it's this, sound play where basically God is like revealing what he's going to do. It's kind of like divine revelation, which is really interesting, because it's not some like little joke or something. I mean, far from it. It's quite the opposite. Yeah, but it's really interesting that that's like couched in, with that kind of twist of the sound. And in Jeremiah as well, Jeremiah 1:11, where, he says, I see the branch of an almond tree, shakade. And he says, I am watching over, God says, I am watching over shokade. It's the same concept, it's just like different vowel, my plans, to accomplish them. So those two instances in Amos and Jeremiah, I think, are significant because God is basically, he's kind of like revealing his will by means of sound play. So I think those show that, there's all sorts of ways that sound play is used. It can be kind of, in small ways and big ways in the Bible. Just a couple, if we have time, I'll just give a couple reflections on sound play in the Psalter. Interestingly, the Psalm 1 of, beginning of the Psalter begins with sound play. So Ashrei Ha'ish Asher, Lo Halach, etc. So like, blessed is the person who, that is, a lot of repetition of sounds. It's similar, interestingly, to like Genesis 1:1, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. So Bereshit bara, it's like the first two words in the Bible. They're, the beginning, it's like the same three consonants. So that's interesting that like Psalms begin that way too. And, like Psalm 23. So though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, gam ki elech b'gei salmavet lo ira ha. There's sound play there. I will not fear evil. You can think that's a very intimate scene, between the speaker and God. It's very intense. The valley of the shadow of death. That text is, so meaningful and to so many people, and yet there's Soundplay right there. So again, it's not like this frivolous thing. It's just like it contributes to the beauty of it, and it's a way to kind of almost like process emotion, or just kind of think through one's relationship with God or realities. And I'll just mention a couple more examples, then we can move on. Is that like Psalm 88 is a very dark psalm. It's the speaker feels abandoned by God and by all of his or her friends, and it's just like it's very kind of dismal picture, and yet there's Soundplay there too. The person says, like, I've been wasting away since my youth, for example, and there's Soundplay there, and in other places in the psalm. One more example, and this is not in the Psalter, but Lamentations is so interesting because it's just full of all kinds of wordplay and Soundplay. Again, those are misnomers because it's not play. Most of the chapters of Lamentations are structured as acrostics, which again, in our culture, acrostics, as parents, we're used to seeing them in maybe kids' books, but it's not the kind of thing that's like high literature generally in our culture. And yet Lamentations is about serious trauma. And yet the acrostics and all this other type of Soundplay and wordplay was seen as a worthy vehicle for working through those emotions and experiences. And, one could say a number of things about that. Maybe it's providing a kind of structure for people to work through difficult experiences. The acrostic, because it's kind of, it's like things are so out of control that we're trying to, create some way to kind of process it. That's one possibility. But yeah, you could even, it's just interesting that even when you're giving voice to, or when the biblical authors are giving voice to very intense emotions, they'll use this kind of intensive literary artistry as well, which is just really interesting to reflect on.
What a great pitch for people to engage with Hebrew and keep at it with Hebrew, right?
Exactly.
This is the kind of stuff that almost 100% of the time you're not going to pick up in translation, because it's almost impossible to pick this stuff up. Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. With my own research, I came across something similar to this, I suppose, but it's definitely related to Soundplay. It was with Ezekiel Kaufman and the debate about whether or not there were actually two trees in the original story of Genesis 2-3 in the Eden narrative, right? The tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Kaufman made a great point or comment, I thought. He said that there's a real rhythmic nature to Genesis 2:9, so there has to be two trees at the beginning of the story. And I thought, what does he mean? But then it's true. If you read it in Hebrew, so it really just works nicely with the way that it sounds, especially in an oral culture. So I wonder how much of importance Soundplay is in a culture that's hearing a text, maybe more than reading it even. So.
Absolutely. And it's interesting to reflect on orality, because our own culture is in a way kind of coming back to orality through like podcasts, for example, audiobooks, because for much of human history, reading was out loud, or listening, you did not sit silently in front of a page. And so that's kind of an aberrant phenomenon in a way, historically, but we tend to think of that as like, that's what reading is,
And now we're all listening to books again, aren't we?
Exactly. Yeah. So, there are things that you can pick up, of course, right, through listening. And that's, that's so important. Or again, reflecting on just being a parent, you're reading to your kids. Like my kids are learning to read themselves now. And so that's an interesting transition, because we still read to them a lot, out loud. But then you think of like, how does the brain process the story? Like, how well do you remember it if you just see it but don't hear it? And what things do you pick up on that you wouldn't pick up on otherwise? And of course, that's just from the perspective of a hearer. If you think of somebody, like a bard or something, somebody who's carrying on a story, in a culture. And there's the Perry Lord, research that was done maybe, in the 20th century about kind of Yugoslav bards. And then that was applied to, ancient cultures like Greek culture, and to some degree, Hebrew culture is it's just amazing, at least to those of us who are not in a predominantly oral culture. It's amazing what large swaths of text people can memorize and you think of and recite. And you think of like, how does how does sound patterning, repetition, of course, repetition maybe at the beginning of a stanza at the end, or the beginning of a story at the end, how does that facilitate memorization, which of course is a whole field and world to itself, but it's fascinating.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, that is fascinating.
So one thing we'd love if maybe be open to walking us through a few lines or maybe a poem from your book, the Psalms, and just show us, what do you see as you take us through a psalm?
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for asking. I was reading recently Psalm 146, so I thought I'd just read a little bit of that. I won't read the whole thing, but maybe most of it. So this is on pages 7 to 8 of the book. Okay. So it starts out by praising the Lord and saying, admonishing the listener not to trust in human beings, basically. And then I'll read starting in verse 5, and then just make a few observations that stuck out at me when I was reading in Hebrew that I had not noticed in English before. So verse 5 is Ashrei she'el Yaakov be'ezro, sivro al Adonai Elohav. So happy or blessed is the person who the God of Jacob is his or her help, and his or her hope is on the Lord, his God or her God. And then verse 6, so this is talking about Yahweh. Oseh shamayim va'aretz, et hayam ve'et kol asher bam. So the maker of heaven and earth, the sea and everything that is in them. Hashomer emet le'olam, who keeps faith or covenant faithfulness forever. Oseh mishpat la'ashukim, who enacts justice for the oppressed. Noten lechem lare'evim, who gives bread or food to the hungry. Adonai matir asurim, the Lord sets prisoners free. Adonai pokeach ivrim, the Lord opens the eyes of the blind. Adonai zokef kufufim, the Lord raises those who are bowed down. Adonai ohev tzadikim, the Lord loves the righteous or is a friend to the righteous. Adonai shomer et gerim, the Lord protects immigrants. Yatom ve'almana yo'oded, he upholds or strengthens the orphan and the widow. V'derech rishaim ya'avet, but he makes crooked the way of the wicked. Then last verse, Yimloch Adonai le'olam, the Lord reigns forever, will reign forever. Elohaich Zion lador vador, your God, O Zion, from generation to generation. Hallelujah. So hallelujah, praise the Lord. So a beautiful psalm. And something that really struck me as I was reading this recently in Hebrew is that in verses 6 and 7, 6 says, Oseh shamayim va'aretz, et hayam ve'et kol asher bam. So it's talking about the Lord, and it says he's the maker of heaven and earth. So, Oseh is called participle. So, he makes heaven and earth, or he made heaven and earth, the sea and everything that's in them. And then you get that same word, Oseh, the same called participle, in verse 7, which is like the first of these, the series of statements where it says like Yahweh does this and he does this and he does this. Oseh mishpat la'ashukim. He creates, to use the same word as in verse 6, justice for the oppressed. And then talks about all these other things that Yahweh does on behalf of the downtrodden, basically. And that really struck me because the same word here is used, and presumably in English you're not going to use the same word there, because it's like you could use make or create for heaven and earth, like he made heaven and earth, but you wouldn't say like he makes justice or creates justice typically in a translation. It just sounds a little odd. But when you see that they're the same word, it really caused me to think that it's maybe the same kind of creative activity that God uses to create and sustain the world. That's what he's doing to recreate and renew the world, specifically by lifting up the downtrodden, by enacting justice, by giving food to the poor, by setting prisoners free, and protecting immigrants. And I thought of that verse in John 5 where Jesus is talking about the Sabbath, and he says, my Father is still working and I also am working. It's kind of that reflection on Genesis 1 where there's the Sabbath rest. So God creates everything in the beginning and then he rests from his labors. And yet Jesus taps into the fact, and this is true in the Hebrew scriptures as well, before the New Testament, that God is obviously continually active, sustaining and recreating everything. And of course, you see this in the ministry of Jesus about, recreation and a lot of these kind of actions. But I think of, both in, Jewish and Christian traditions. I mean, in Jewish tradition, sometimes people will speak of tikkun v'tikva, of healing and hope, kind of repairing and hoping. And like, as our kind of main prerogative is like, that's what we bring to the world. We bring healing, repair, and we have hope for the future. And of course, that's true in the Christian tradition as well. And, think of Christians speak about being the hands and feet of Jesus, and so you think about how does Yahweh actually enact these things? How does he create these things and kind of recreate? It's through us, largely, perhaps even. And it's a remarkable thing that, God invites us to participate in this creative activity that is kind of, bringing his kingdom into being, if you will. So that's wow. Kind of a lot that, is that really there in the text? But it's more like that was a springboard, just slowing down, seeing that simple thing. There's nothing complex about the verb asa in Hebrew. There's nothing magical about it. It's just the word to do. I mean, it's a very common word. And yet the fact that it was repeated there it was a springboard for me to think about all those other things. And that's one of the reasons I love reading the text in the original, is just it can, open up our eyes to all these things.
That's amazing. This is a perfect example of this, because you're exactly right. I don't know almost any English translation that would translate both verbs ose as the same word. And yet it seems the author's trying to link the idea of God's creative work, how he is created, and his justice and what he does. It's interesting you bring this up. I was just reading Psalm 113 with one of my classes, which is a psalm that connects this idea that God is the one who's above the heavens, where his great high throne is. And in the same time, he's also the one who goes down and lifts up the poor from the dust. And it's just, who is this God who's the one who has created and is above the heavens? Yet one of his core attributes is he goes down to the lowliest of the earth to lift them up. And the way you extrapolate this, as you said, a springboard into other conversations about the Bible. This is awesome. This is excellent.
Yeah,
great insights.
Yeah, and that reminds me of the two Psalms that precede 113 is 111 and 112, and interestingly, there, those are both acrostics, and so they seem to be related. And in one of those, it calls God Chanun v'Rachum v'Tzadik, so he's gracious and righteous, and or gracious and compassionate and righteous. But then the other one, I think, it says that the righteous person is those things, and it's a clear verbal connection. And so that's just interesting too to reflect on. It's like people as reflecting the image of God in those kind of activities.
Yeah, man, this gets me so excited.
It does, because it's good theology too, and that nice connection there with creation and sort of a new creation, right? It's like you say with the ministry of Jesus, connecting it to many of those ideas right there in the Psalm. The Olam Haba, the world to come, has broken forth, right? It has broken forth, and the Creator's here doing it again. So it's marvelous. It's great. So let's, I got a question here for you, a little bit away from the Psalms, more about your professional life at present, working for such a wonderful publisher as Hendrickson. The question is this: how has working for a publisher enriched your knowledge as a writer and a researcher in this field? Because I have no doubt that it has. So I'd love to know some of your thoughts on that.
It has indeed. I absolutely love working for Hendrickson. I feel like it's a perfect fit for me, and I'm so grateful to work here and with my wonderful colleagues and to do the kind of projects that we do. It's just great. I think one of the main things is that I think about a lot is just, again, how to make things accessible. So we talked at the beginning of our conversation about this goal to make the Hebrew text and the Greek text of the Bible and the Aramaic text too. You want to forget Aramaic to make it accessible, to as many people as possible. And I try not only with the original languages, but just with all of the projects that I work on at Hendrickson and the books that I acquire. There's so much rich scholarship out there, and there's so much, you can spend a lifetime just learning a little bit of it. And so the real question for me is, what can I do and what can we do as a team here at Hendrickson to bring that excellent scholarship to people in a way that is kind of fresh and creative and very accessible? Because like you were saying earlier about the BHS, often we go from our initial Hebrew studies to the BHS. And that's kind of a shock because, yeah, there's a lot of text critical data, and it's just, you're staring at like this big block of text that's kind of hard. It's intimidating. And so the data are there. It's not, what makes the Hebrew text, for example, inaccessible is not the fact that we cannot find printed copies of it. It's that we have their difficulty just kind of accessing, because there's so many data there, and you have to gloss, and you have to parse, and you have to do text criticism and stuff. And so I really love thinking about, in terms of this, all the great scholarship that's out there, and just the biblical text. And it's taken a lot of work by many great scholars to put things like the VHS together. Of course, that is the fruit of many years of labor. But you think, like, we're kind of standing on the shoulders of giants, as it were. There's all this stuff, and so, like, how do we bring that to as many people as possible who can really be nurtured by it, encouraged by it, and empowered to feel like, hey, I can do this too. I don't need to have a PhD, or even if I do, I can do this, and I can get stuff out of it. I mean, like, our conversation about about those Psalms just a minute ago, I was like, we can talk about this all day long. It's so great. So no matter what stage you're at, there's always this richness. So I think just making things accessible is one of the things that, working at a job that's not in academia per se. I mean, it's like pretty academic what I do here, but I'm not, professor. And so I think I constantly kind of have one foot in the academy, but also one foot in kind of like, okay, this needs to sell more than like 10 copies, this book, so it's got to be like not completely esoteric. And also we want to have a ministry, and we want, people to really be nourished by this. A lot of people, as many people as can be. And, of course, I mean, there are the many other things too. I mean, one of the things that's great about this job is I get to work with people of various religious stripes. I work with Jewish scholars, with Christian scholars, with scholars who are not believers of any kind, but who are just like really into the Bible. And I love working with various kinds of people. I always learn a lot from them, and it's just great interacting with different types of people. And I get to have my hand in various subdisciplines too. Like, I get to do New Testament stuff. Like, I'm not trained in New Testament per se, but I'm a little bit of a dilettante, but hopefully I know enough to at least make certain contributions, or to come alongside authors, and to hopefully make intelligent comments and constructive criticism, things like that, or even occasionally rabbinics and stuff like that. That's also a little bit further afield from what my training is in. So I feel really privileged because I'm able to learn from scholars who are producing material on those subjects that is beyond me. But I also, hopefully know enough that I can at least provide some helpful feedback. So just kind of like getting that, rounded experience, which is really good. And just lastly, I'd say that, of course, when you're helping other people learn to write clearly and well, that obviously helps you yourself learn to write clearly and well. And you think through the issues a lot. And of course, I also need help with my writing. So whenever I write, things, I'm just glad to have an office full of editors and other publishing professionals where I can say, like, hey, can you read this for me? Tell me how it can be better, because I need it too. So
it's so true. I always tell my students, writing is rewriting. People don't think about this, right? But it really is. So it is rewriting. And I will say, I mean, your reader, this Hebrew reader, really shows. Really your heart, and of course Pete's heart, but really what Hendrickson is doing well here and making this accessible in a way. I said in the last interview with Pete, I said it's great for learning Hebrew, for reading the Psalms and being able to engage it, as we were just talking, not having just to go straight to the BHS, but also feels kind of like a prayer book, right? I mean, it's nice in the way that it's actually presented. And but from just being able to read to engaging it at the highest level with the appendices that you have and all of that, I just think it's fantastic. It really shows the great work that you're doing. So well done. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I really think I love thinking about design issues and aesthetics. And yeah, I agree. I think that is important. And again, as we think about print versus oral culture, if we're producing books in print, it's important to think about the book as an actual physical item, because you're having an experience when you read a book. It's not just data that's coming off the page. I mean, I care probably a little bit too much about fonts and things like that. But to me, that's all part of the experience. It's all part of the aesthetic experience. And like you said, it can read as a prayer book. And I do find that in terms of accessibility of the language is one thing that can make them more accessible, yes, laying things out really clearly. I know that just for me, the way my brain works, I really want there to be, white space and for things to be uncluttered, because I don't want the text when I'm reading, especially the biblical text, where you want it, it's intellectual, it's devotional, it's emotional, it's everything. I want that to be the experience in itself. Like, I don't want to be reading a book that's kind of going to like get me to an experience later, that's like a bridge to like, well, I'm doing all this hard work. And I think that's something that is, that's necessary, obviously, in study. That's part of it. It's just part of the thing. But I think often when we're studying languages, especially ancient languages, I think it's easy for a lot of us to feel discouraged and feel that, well, I'm spending all this time and money and energy like doing something that is really not the end in itself, but it's like a bridge to something that later that like hopefully I will be able to do, like sit down with the text. And so part of making the text accessible for me is providing something that you feel like this experience that you're having with this text right now is an end in itself. It's not like I'm not just doing a bunch of parsing so that then later I can go read the text. It's like I'm doing what I can. I don't know everything. I'm still learning, but at least I can, this experience is very meaningful. So again, I'm going on a little bit, but that's part of the reason why, to me, the aesthetics of the actual, book are important, because it facilitates that experience.
It's excellent. Yeah.
Yeah, we very much appreciate all the work you and Hendrickson have been doing. In general, I especially have enjoyed all the readers that you've done, and your team's worked on, everything from the entire Hebrew Bible, the one that focuses on Aramaic, the Psalms one. It's been phenomenal. So, and by the way, also they're very beautiful. The material that they're made for the covers, as well as the inside, which I think is important, because every time you want it to be something you want to grab, that you want to open up, and that draws you in. And so the high quality materials that these books are made up to, I think, is very important. Nathan, why don't you ask our last question, then I'll do a wrap up final question.
Okay, great. Yeah, let's do. So the last question here, we also asked this to Pete. So it's, you're at this level as well, probably early career scholar of the Hebrew Bible and ancient Near East, right? So, but what advice would you have for those people who are stepping out of the PhD into the real world? They have this Hebrew Bible or ancient Near Eastern study, or even biblical studies in general. What's the advice that you would give to them in stepping out in the great beyond?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll offer what perhaps little advice I can, but I guess I've been around long enough that I can maybe say a few things. Well, as we've been talking about making things relevant, I think that's something that I would encourage listeners to do is just if you think about like the history of the world and how many people have been able to engage in graduate studies in biblical studies. Now, if you think of our present moment, it may seem like everybody's got a degree in biblical studies and we're all trying to find jobs. It's really bad market and stuff. It can be discouraging. It kind of seems like, oh, there's so many biblical studies, people there, professionals. And yet, if you think about the history of the world, like what a gift we've been given, like what a privilege, because most people for whom the Bible's been sacred, or just, most of humanity in general, has not, had the opportunities that many of us have had. And we're very blessed. And so I know that in the kind of workaday life and applying to jobs and stuff, it's easy to lose sight of that. But I just want to encourage listeners to think, what can we do with our lives with the skills we've been given? And there are many different ways. That's why I think thinking creatively is a helpful thing, and thinking flexibly, because we are in a changing time in terms of markets and professorships and tenure and all these things. It's things are changing and they're difficult to work through sometimes. And so being adaptable, flexible, thinking creatively, and thinking like, how can I use the gifts that I personally have and the training that I've been given to bless other people and to make this work accessible. Again, easier said than done, but that's something that I think I've been reminded of as I've kind of gone through my trajectory. And on the other hand, of course, it's important to do really good academic research too. And I guess in that regard, people will often ask me like, well, should I publish my dissertation, or how much, should I rework it and stuff? And I think I think it can differ for every person. There's no one size fits all, but I think in my own experience and in having friends and knowing people who, are finishing grad school, I tend to err on the side of, just trying to get your dissertation published, get it out there, then move on toward other things. Yeah. Because I think it's easy. It can be easy to get bogged down in one project and think like, oh, I got to make this perfect, and grad school can kind of instill that in us and think like, well, I spent so much time on this already. I got to like make it like really accessible and stuff. But the thing is like, I'll just reflect on my own dissertation. It's like, all right, it's a pretty small audience. I think it's a useful contribution, but I wrote it, I got it out there, I moved on, and I hope it's helpful to readers, So I think working in publishing, I take that view too, where it's like dissertations are meant, to be helpful and to be used, but hardly any dissertation is going to have a giant market. So, just kind of view that as one step and then move on to other things you could build off of it, build creatively off of it. Again, there's no one size fits all. And I realize that even just revising your dissertation a little bit for publication can take a lot of time and be very difficult, especially if you have a family and a job and stuff. So I'm very sympathetic to that. I'm just saying I tend to err on the side of, people want to read what you've done, so just try to get it out there. And I guess from the publishing standpoint, I'll say that it's publishers, we want material to publish. Like we're looking for authors, and so I think sometimes when you're looking to get your own material published, whether it's your dissertation, your early career, or whether you're moving further in your career, a lot of it's about finding a good fit. It's easy to be intimidated and feel like, oh, there's all these publishers, and it's kind of like there's this brick wall between me. You got to apply and all this kind of stuff. But there will very likely be a publisher that's a great fit for your work, and if it's not the X publisher, it will be Y publisher. My stuff's been my dissertation was rejected by the first publisher that I gave it to, and that was it was fine. And then I sent it to another publisher, and it was a good fit, and it was great. And so, and not everything that comes to us at Hendrickson, in terms of acquisitions, is a good fit for us. But we often try to think like, okay, what is there another publisher that could be a good fit for this, and refer people, and some stuff is a really good fit. So I just want to encourage listeners to not feel intimidated by the whole, kind of publishing industry, which can feel intimidating, especially if you haven't published yet. But and I guess one more piece of advice that I'd give that's related to that is, and it's obvious, but of course, networking is just really helpful. Get to know editors. I mean, editors want to get to know authors, especially authors who are just starting out in their career. So, you can have a cup of coffee at SBL with an editor or other people in publishing, and that's great. It's a lot about just making connections and, again, finding the good fit, and then people can, recommend your work to other people they know and things like that. So I just kind of want to share the love from the publishing world, I guess, to those who are starting out, and say like, we're all on the same team, because that doesn't always feel that way, I think, when you're coming out of grad school, but like we're all like trying to advance knowledge. We're all serving the academy. It's like we're serving faith communities as well. We're trying to get good material like published. And so I think just viewing it as like, this is a collective effort where we're ultimately kind of all on the same team. I hope that's a point of encouragement.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good. That is very encouraging. I know our listeners are going to really enjoy that little bit of wisdom there at the end, especially. So that's fantastic. So.
Yeah, Jonathan, we've so appreciated this conversation. You very much have modeled exactly what you've just been talking about. I think your mixture of expertise with humility, but with your care for purpose of actually being relevant and helping other people is evident in everything you do. And I'm glad we get to do an interview like this so people can also feel that in a more personal way, right? They might pick up your works, and this is cool if we get to get just a little behind the scenes. So thank you for sharing yourself with us. One last just quick question. Maybe you can just tell us just a little bit about yourself, as well as if people want to connect more with your content and with you, where's the best way for them to find your content? And if you want maybe another little elevator pitch for the book, your most recent project.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I guess a little bit about myself. So I actually grew up in a family of Old Testament professors. So my grandfather, Meredith Kline, who is kind of well known in at least small Reformed circles, but not everywhere. Anyway,
I had no idea. Meredith Kline is wow. Okay.
Yeah. And confusingly, my dad is also named Meredith Kline. They have a different middle initial. So anyway, sometimes people refer to my grandfather as my dad. Anyway, so yeah, my grandpa taught Old Testament at various seminaries, and then my dad also did. and taught Hebrew. So I kind of grew up around this stuff. Although I didn't learn, people often ask if I learned Hebrew as a kid, and like I did not learn Hebrew until I went to college, just for the record. But I grew up in that kind of academic atmosphere, and actually, my wife has a PhD in Hebrew Bible,
Wow.
and she's an Old Testament professor. But we're not teaching our kids Hebrew, at least yet. So people ask,
I was just going to ask. Yes.
Actually, people usually ask if we're teaching our kids Akkadian. And I said, no, we're not teaching them Akkadian. Yeah. Maybe we'll teach them Hebrew at some point.
Sumerian,
yeah. We have been memorizing Psalm 23 together as a family lately, and our kids are memorizing in English, and we're memorizing it in Hebrew together. And so, like, we say it at the dinner table, and so they get to hear that Hebrew, but we're not, going through paradigms yet. In any case. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me. In terms of where to find books, just the usual places. I have a little bit of an online presence, mostly on academia.edu, where I just post reviews and occasionally some sample pages and things. But just the usual online pages. You can go look for sample material. There are, if you work with digital platforms like Accordance or Logos, some of the books I've worked on are there, like a Proverb a day, or the Keep Up Your Biblical Hebrew in 2 minutes a day, or Keep Up Your Biblical Greek in 2 minutes a day. So, if you can access things electronically in that way as well as in print. I guess elevator pitch for the Psalms book. It definitely is meant to be a language tool and a devotional simultaneously. As we were talking about before, a book that you really just want to pick up. I have it by my bed. I read it at night. And I hope that, other people have a similar experience where it's just, you can dip into it. And where you feel like even if you're spending a couple minutes with it, that's great. You get something out of it. Or if you have a half an hour to spend with it, then you get something out of it. So you can be flexible on the time, because we're all really busy and we have a lot of demands in our lives. And so I think it's a book that you can pick up, and it's graded in terms of difficulty level. So, well, first of all, it's organized by genre. So we basically laid out, Pete and I laid out, the 40 Psalms that are in the book according to, about a half dozen or so different genres. And then within each genre category, we've ordered the text by rough difficulty level. And so you can, and we've talked in the beginning of the book about, different ways you might approach reading the book, starting out with the kind of easier Psalms in each category at first, or working through one genre. You could work on one Psalm a month, one Psalm a week, things like that. So we try to give tips to kind of help people, again, access the book no matter where they're at in terms of their language abilities or how much time they have. Ultimately, of course, it's all about the text. And so whatever you want to do with the cantillation or the glossing or the parsing or whatever, the text is just really cleanly laid out with spacing, a lot of, white space and spacing that's based on the accents. And so that's in order to facilitate slowing down, taking it piece by piece. And so, and you can just kind of, there's other information there, but hopefully the formatting allows you to just have an intimate experience with the text and with God.
That's good.
Just by the way it's laid out.
So good. Well, once again, thank you so much for coming. We have really enjoyed having you on. And this is exactly why we're doing a podcast like this. We want to get great scholars like yourselves, great publishers like Hendrickson for more people to experience. And so thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you guys so much. It's been a real pleasure.